Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemerovski, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program. We talk about why our political system is dysfunctional and polarized, and we always try and talk on every show about solutions. What are we going to do about it? Every once in a while, I like to get a little bit outside the box, and we're going to do that today because I've been reading more and more lately and hearing stories lately about the decline of democracy, quite frankly, across the world. Some people think it's a result of actions that are occurring in the United States, and some people think it's just stuff going on in the rest of the world, whether it's related to immigration or whatever the issues are. But there's definitely a decline in democracy, and I find this troubling, and I wanted to talk about it. And I ran across an old friend, Mike Abramowitz. I've known Mike for quite a while, and he's a great guy, and he's landed a place called Freedom House. He hasn't just landed there, he's the president of Freedom House. And one of the goals of Freedom House is to study the world, what's going on in the world in terms of freedom and democracy. They write annual reports. They do some fascinating work. So I wanted to drill down today and visit with Freedom House, Mike Abramowitz, and talk about their work and, again, get you educated on what's going on, not just in the U.S., but around the entire world. So, Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here, Nemo.
So, Mike, you and I have known each other for a while, but we just caught up a few weeks ago in D.C. when my daughter was in town, and I was hearing more about Freedom House. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up in Freedom House, and then we'll start talking about Freedom House itself.
Sure. So I've been at Freedom House now for just over a year, but my background is as a reporter and journalist. I was for almost 25 years a political journalist at the Washington Post. I covered local and national politics. I was the national editor for a while. My last job at the Post was at the as a national editor. No, I'm sorry. I was national editor, then I was a White House correspondent under the second term of George Bush. And obviously, we can talk about journalism. It's changed a lot. And I left the Post around 2009, and I worked for 8 years in senior positions at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And I came to Freedom House to run the show here in early 2017, just after the inauguration of Donald Trump.
So what caught your attention about Freedom House? I know you've been very successful. You had a great career. Obviously, you decided to make a switch. Something about Freedom House must have excited you.
Well, a number of things excited me, but I would say the thing that was most interesting to me was it was really an opportunity to work on what I think is one of the most serious problems in the world today, which is the decline of freedom, the decline of democracy, which, as you said, Steve, in your introduction, is a global phenomenon which we can talk about. Freedom House is one of actually the oldest pro-democracy organizations in America. We were founded, believe it or not, in 1941 by a group of individuals who were quite concerned about the rise of fascism in Europe, the rise of communism. They were particularly concerned about what was then called the America First movement. There's a new America First movement today, but the America First movement then wanted to keep America out of the European war. And Freedom House basically came into being under the patronage of Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, who was a Republican who had run against Eleanor's husband, FDR, in the 1940 elections. And we came together on a bipartisan, really nonpartisan basis to advocate for policies on behalf of democracy and freedom. And that's the history of Freedom House. And today we're about a 150 people organization. The thing we're probably best known for is our annual surveys of political rights and civil liberties in the world. We've been doing this for almost 50 years. It's called Freedom in the World. And but we also have a lot of other programs we do. We support human rights defenders and human rights activists who are working in troubled countries around the world. So we do a range of things. We can get into that depending on what you're interested in.
And you actually have a very large field organization. You have people located in many countries to study what's going on in those countries.
Yes. We work abroad in about 25 different countries. We have, in some countries, we have, a staff presence. In other countries, we have people going in and out. We also, in some countries we work, but we can't really talk about what we do publicly because it would put our people at risk. But we basically run different types of programs to support the aspirations of the human rights community. We help them document human rights abuses in their country. We provide emergency aid for those who get in trouble. And one of the real phenomenons that you've seen over the last 10 years or so is that one of the things that authoritarian countries do is they try to really crack down on civil society and make it hard for them to operate. And so we're trying to, in our own small way, support the aspirations of civil society.
Now, I know you have a press background. Do most of the people you have work in other countries? Do they have a press background or like an investigative background, so to speak?
No. It's a range of different things. We have some people with a press background, but we also have people who kind of come from kind of the development community and have worked on running programs in other countries. We have people who are kind of human rights activists, people who really know how to document and protect human rights and can advise others about how to do that well. So we have a range of different expertise. We do have some former journalists here. I'm one of them, but I'm not the only one.
And at the same time, you're periodically or consistently collecting data about how you define the existence or lack of freedom in a country.
Right. So that's really the core thing that Freedom House does, that we produce an annual survey called Freedom in the World, which came out just about 4 or 5 months ago, rating 2017. And we put that together with a staff, really with our own staff, but we also work with researchers and consultants in about 100 different countries who are, reporting on the conditions regarding political rights and civil liberties in their own country.
Now, as you said, you started in 1941. You've kind of morphed a little bit over the years. For how long have you been studying specifically this aspect of freedom in other countries?
Our report started in 1972. That was the first year of Freedom in the World, and we've been doing it for now, I guess, 45 or 46 years. A few years after that, we also started doing Freedom of the Press, which is another report that we've done. Also, a more recent report that we do that is really, I think, quite interesting, especially given trends in technology, is Freedom on the Internet, which looks at how governments are controlling and repressing freedom on the Internet. And then we also do other studies, like we do one annually looking at the status of democratic development in the former Soviet bloc. That's called Nations in Transit. And I think that one thing that kind of is a common thread through all of our reports is that I would say that over the last decade or so, maybe a little bit more, you've seen a lot of pressure, downward pressure on political rights and civil liberties. So, for instance, if you look at Freedom in the World, over the last 12 years, you've had many more countries suffering a decline in political rights and civil liberties, and those having improvement. So, for instance, in 2017, you had 70 countries recording declines, and you had about 35 recording improvements. So this has been going on now for about 12 years, and we can talk about some of the specific countries, but I think some academics have pointed to the Freedom House data and said, we're in kind of a democracy recession. Or another way of looking at it is that, at the end of the Cold War, even before the end of the Cold War, there was this so-called third wave of democratization, where many countries have been becoming democracies, former dictatorships in Latin America, the former Soviet bloc, and so you had a steady democratization that kind of ended around 2005, and now for the last 12 or 13 years, you've had a pretty much of a downward trend in these. Now, in the big picture, there are many more democracies in the world now than there were in 1941 when we first started. So, it depends what your baseline is. But things have been going in a bad direction for the last 12 or 13 years. And if it's not halted, we would be quite concerned about that.
Yeah, how do you go about defining and setting the parameters for your definitions? Do you have a committee that continuously looks at how to define freedom, how to define democracy? How does that come about?
Yes. We work very closely with academic experts on this. what we do basically is that, and this methodology has been kind of developed over the course of time, but it's pretty. One of the things we like about it is that it's been pretty stable, and so you can really get a good picture of the of the longitudinal trends. But essentially, we are looking at what we define as political rights and civil liberties. So, things like, are there free and fair elections? Does the government represent the will of the people? There are 25 different indicators that we look at. And by the way, about a year ago, we brought in some of the top academics, to look at our methodology, and they said, this works. So we basically are asking questions about the political rights and civil liberties experienced by the people who live in a country, or in some cases a territory. And what happens is that we have an on-the-ground researcher who takes a first cut at sort of an assessment of how the country did, and then we have basically a dialogue with the Freedom House staff and other experts, and at the end of the day, after a process this last couple months, you end up with kind of a consensus score. And the way the system works, they're not like really major, oscillations on a year-by-year basis. You see the slow improvement or the slow decline in the status of political rights and civil liberties.
Do you get much pushback from people who say that, hey, wait, these scores aren't right, democracy's flourishing, you guys aren't looking at the right data?
It's a good question. We definitely get pushback from the bad guys. So one of the things that's quite interesting about Freedom House is that because our scores get a lot of attention, we have countries that are basically authoritarian in nature often criticizing us because they don't like to be embarrassed, or they push back for reasons of containing bad publicity. So I would say, though, that by and large, scholars and academics and experts do feel that our scores are basically sound. There's no question when you're analyzing 200 countries a year, you're looking at 24 different indicators, a lot of different questions. We're going to get things wrong from time to time. I'm not going to say we're always perfect, but I think over time, our scores and our judgments have held up, and they actually, there are other people who do this kind of analysis every year, like The Economist. The Economist magazine in Great Britain, they have an intelligence unit that also looks at scores, and their measures of democracy very much track our measures. I mean, I think, for instance, what I'm saying to you about there being like a democracy recession is pretty well accepted among experts.
Now, my sense is a democracy recession, and my definitions, of course, may be different. But one of my complaints back home in the U.S. is our voter turnout is horrible. And,
yes.
And we get no turnout whatsoever. And I pick up the paper today, they had the elections in Turkey, and they had an 87% turnout. Now, that's a country that, based upon a lot of different measures, is arguably in decline of democracy. But they have an 87% turnout for their elections. So they may point to us and say, hey, wait a minute, at least our citizenry comes to vote. You don't even vote in America. How can you judge us?
Well, I think that's a valid concern. I mean, you're raising a couple different issues there, Steve. I mean, I would say one thing would be that one thing that I'm very proud about with Freedom House is that we always, take a hard look at ourselves, right? We're not going to just be judging what Turkey and Russia and Venezuela and the Philippines and South Africa say. We also, in every one of our reports, we always analyze what the status of freedom in the United States, and we have been concerned about the general trends over the last, I would say, 6 or 7 years. This did not start with President Trump. We had concerns about things that happened under the Obama administration as well. I mean, one thing I should say about Freedom House, just as an aside before I forget, I want your viewers to know, we are a fiercely nonpartisan and bipartisan organization. Right now, we've had Republicans chairs of the board. Right now we have a Democrat, but it goes really back and forth, and people kind of check their party at the door when they come to serve on the Freedom House board. We really are we believe in that. But I think your general point is right, that we do take a look at what's happening in America, and I think what's happening in America, does make it difficult sometimes for us to make pronouncements about other countries. So I think that's a valid point. I will say that I think you have to put this in context. While there are clearly problems in U.S. democracy, and we can talk about that if you like, I think the truth is that we still have compared to other countries, we still have a very vibrant and robust democracy in our view. We still are, we group countries in three categories: free, partially free, and not free. The U.S. is still in the free category. We still have very
let's
high
hope we always
scores
stay there, right?
Relative to other countries. So, I think that, yes, President Erdogan can complain about voter turnout or point to voter turnout, but in the United States, as much as we're concerned about certain things, we're not throwing journalists in jail. We're not imprisoning our political rivals. We are not, kind of rigging the system to make sure that you can stay in power for years and years. So I think you got to have some context in looking at this.
So that brings up a good point. You have all these different measures, and you indicated earlier that you have this new phase of looking at the use of technology and artificial intelligence. How has that affected your studies over the past few years?
Well, I think that, I think the area that is the most relevant is, we do measure kind of freedom on the internet, which is this is our newest survey, because we just recognize that there's so much change happening in technology that that we had to kind of really take a look at, like, really how can governments use technology to kind of infringe on freedom. And it's interesting, Steve, because I think when the internet first became a thing, maybe what 10, 15 years ago, it was really seen as a liberating technology, right? That it was really seen, like, for instance, in the Arab Spring in 2011, it was seen as an organizing tool by human rights activists in Egypt and other countries to kind of protest against their government's practices. It was really seen as a positive thing, and I think we've seen in the last couple of years the fact that it's a double-edged sword, right? There's still very good things about the internet, but it also offers an opportunity for governments to repress freedom, to basically limit undermine democracy. I mean, I think, for instance, one of the key findings of our last report is that there's been a lot of attention in our country to the fact that the Russians, tried to, interfere with our democracy by undermining, by using social media to sow discord and to kind of undermine democracy. It's not just happening in Russia. Other countries are also manipulating the internet. So this is a global phenomenon, and I think it's going to take a while to sort out, but I think it's posing very serious challenges, because how do you regulate this? Do you want to, are you comfortable with if Facebook were to, regulate speech in a way? We don't like it when the government does that, but is it okay for a tech company to do that? I think it's raising a lot of profound questions that are going to be sorted out, and that candidly we don't have all the answers to yet.
And I know you're measuring governments, but when you bring up tech companies, do you think you have to start measuring companies too? I mean, obviously, Facebook and Google, some of these companies, they screen stuff all the time, and they decide what you get to look at. That probably has an effect on the overall freedom that you see people having in different countries too. Absolutely.
It's a very valid point, and something that I've thought about a lot, because our report really focuses on government manipulation, censorship, control the internet, and I think that's an important issue, and that's kind of our angle into this. There are others, for instance, a woman named Rebecca McKinnon, who's at the New America Foundation. She's been doing a rating of companies for how they deal with freedom and democracy issues. So there are other indices that look at those kinds of questions. I think at Freedom House we've always looked at governments in particular, but I think you're raising a valid point, which is that the role of these tech companies can in fact contribute to either an improvement or a diminution of our freedom.
So you found generally there's been this 12-year decline in democracy, freedom, however you define it. It's probably ongoing. I'm wondering if this is similar, though, to other periods in history. In other words, this kind of relates to the Great Recession and the fact there's been recessionary problems, and we have not had full recovery from recession, as far as I can tell. It also relates to massive periods of immigration. Are
Yes.
these common historic triggers that people take advantage of to repress freedom and democracy?
Well, I think you've just hit on two things that I think about a lot. Economic conditions and also immigration. Basically, we have the world's biggest immigration crisis really since World War II going on now. And so I think that's causing a reaction in certain countries and causing governments to take steps that we believe could, diminish freedom. And so, a period, Steve, you and I have talked a lot about, because I used to work at the Holocaust Museum, is the 1930s, right? So the 1930s was probably the period of the greatest, economic calamity in the world, in our memory. I wasn't alive then, but the Great Depression, you had 25-30% people out of work. You had people really questioning in America the efficacy of the capitalist system, really for in a very serious way. And I think so. It's not surprising to me that in that kind of environment, you had countries like Nazi Germany and others, basically saying, "Hey, we can solve these problems with more authoritarian, dictatorial approaches." And so I think you do see. So that would be that's a historical point that I think about a lot. I think we're in better shape than we were in the 30s today, but I think there are reasons to be concerned about the trajectory of things. So I think one point about democracy that I would say, and actually there's a very good book by Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State during the Bush administration, and she basically sees democracy, and I think it's right, as kind of a imperfect system. We're kind of moving in some ways 2 steps forward, then 1 step back. So, it's not like, we kind of have this assumption sometimes that history just plays itself forward. But in fact, if you look at the story of democracy, you see situations in which there's bursts of democratization, followed by a downturn. And I think, we're now in, a kind of the third democratic wave crashed, and now we're in a period of downturn. And I hope we can turn it around. I mean, I think one country that I'm quite concerned about is China, because, China, we assumed maybe 10, 15 years ago that this was, as China became economically more liberal, opened itself up, had a more capitalist system, that political rights would follow. And that's not happening. And so China is really posing a very serious challenge to the rest of the world, or for those who believe in democracy and freedom and these values, because they're saying, well, you can have a capitalist system in which you can have economic growth in a system of kind of repression. And that, I think in the long term that's not going to work, but I think it's a challenge to those of us who really believe in these values.
Now, one phenomenon I study on my show, we talk about demographics a lot and population shifts and things like that. We have something going on, perhaps across the entire world right now, we've never had before. We have these aging populations, and we do not have young bases coming in that support them economically, et cetera, et cetera. Is there anything about these demographic shifts in aging populations that relates to any of your findings, or you haven't been able to think that through yet?
Well, I certainly am thinking about it a lot. I mean, let me say a couple things. I mean, I think one interesting phenomenon, well, first of all, I think that one of the major issues in the world today is the fact that democratic countries like the United States, like France, like Great Britain, and others around the world, but let's say those three, have been really kind of unable to deliver for their populations on a widespread basis, consistent economic growth in which the fruits of that labor are really shared by a broad cross-section of society. So that's generating a lot of political heat and some of the pressure, some of the anti-democratic pressures that we're talking about. And so I think that, unless these countries are able to solve these kind of economic challenges, and I think the issue of the aging of the population is one of those economic challenges, it's going to make it harder and harder, to kind of defend democracy in the long term, because people in the end want to see a system of government working for them. So I think it's one more pressure. The other thing I would say, Steve, is that if you look at polling about this issue, it's interesting. There is some suggestion in polling that young people are less attached to living in a democracy than their parents and their grandparents. So, like, the farther you get from those who are close to the Cold War totalitarian settings, the less value is being attached to living in a democracy. Now, there's a lot of debate about that, and some people say that's overblown. But if young people are turning away from democracy, that would really be a very serious problem in the long term.
No, I've seen those studies, and they're very, very scary. So, Mike, time always flies with my guests, and you're an old friend, and time has flown for us. But before we have to run here, tell my viewers how they can find out more about Freedom House, learn more about your work, get your reports.
Well, just come to our website, www.freedomhouse.org. That's the best way. We put all our reports online there. We're actually, one of our big projects for the next year is we want to create a more interactive database so people, students and others can search the reports more easily. That's a big priority for me. But come to our website. Follow us on social media at Freedom House or on Facebook. We're constantly putting out information. We actually have a very interesting poll. We haven't talked about it, but maybe next time, Steve. We have a poll we're releasing tomorrow with the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas and also the Penn Biden Center, which is a public policy arm for Vice President Biden. It's a poll of American attitudes towards democracy. And in some ways, it's going to show a mixed picture where people, I think, are very committed to living in a democracy, but they also are worried about the trajectory of things. And I think if you come to Freedom House tomorrow, you'll be able to find a link to that poll, which I would really urge you to look at.
Well, Mike, you're a great guest. You've given me an idea. I think we should do this interview at least once every year and figure out where we stand in the world in terms of freedom and democracy.
That would be great. We can do it every year after we release our report, and we can go over the findings in depth.
Awesome.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Mike. Well, thank you for watching. As always, our goal is to educate you. We try to provide solutions. I don't know if we found any solutions today for this decline in democracy, but just getting you to think about it, read about it, go to the freedomhouse.org website, and study what's going on in the world. Because unfortunately and sadly, if it can happen in other places in the world, it can stop happening here. We're the world's greatest democracy, but we have to fight for our democracy every day. We have to protect it. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.